many places in my life and time. I sung a lot of songs, I've made some bad rhymes.
The world plunged into mourning earlier on this Thursday when news broke that the legendary Pelé had lost his battle with cancer. Pelé, who was surrounded by a close family in a room at a hotel in Sao Paulo, was 82. Donald Oliver prepared this tribute to the man regarded as football's best ever.
Exploits on a football field have been the standard for generations. Generations of athletes and the spectators. His significance to sport is well documented. And while the debate rages about on who is the greatest of all time, Pelé was the first to achieve immortality, 3 World Cups, and the metaphorical title of King. His first World Cup in Sweden in 1958 saw him score 6 goals. The 17-year-old, the youngest ever at a FIFA World Cup, scored a hat-trick in the semi-final against France and 2 in the final against the host Sweden. He missed the majority of the World Cup 4 years later when he played just 2 matches. And in 1970, he was a symbol of Brazil's campaign, capped off in triumph thanks to his goal against Italy in the final, as well as the famous assist for Carlos Alberto. Pelé was declared a national treasure by the Brazilian government. This was in an attempt to ward off exuberant offers from the richest European clubs. Despite those restrictions, he was a global superstar. How much of an impact did he have? Well, in 1967, Pelé, along with his Brazilian club Santos, traveled to Nigeria amid a civil war, where a 48-hour ceasefire was agreed to allow the nation to watch the Black Pearl. In 1978, he received the International Peace Award. In 1980, he was named Athlete of the Century by L'Equipe, the French sports publication. There is a Pelé Museum in Santos, Brazil, which was opened in 2014. He's a best-selling author and also a musical composer, including for his film, Pelé. A larger-than-life character who redefined the greatest show on earth and global sports on a whole, has died at 82.
Joining us on the phone is Juan G. Arango. With us also on Zoom is Simon Evans. Gentlemen, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
How are you, good sir?
I'm very well, better, sir. Good to be speaking to you good to be speaking to you. I wish it were under different circumstances. Let me start with you, Juan, given your umbilical link to South American football. For those who have only just come, and who are used to the headlines about other players and their exploits, and of course would have had the generational disadvantage of not knowing what and who Pelé was truly beyond the headlines. What kind of player are we talking about?
You know what, George? It's interesting that you mention this because first and foremost, there was a video that came out during the World Cup. And it showed some of the greatest moves of certain players, the Cruyffs, Messi's, Cristiano Ronaldo's, et cetera, throughout history. And they would always say, oh, but Pelé also did that. So it shows you the skill they had. I also remember a good friend of mine who played for Santos. It was his debut back in 1974, I should say, when Pelé ends up leaving Santos and going to the United States. He tells me that the difference between Pelé and everybody else was that, for example, Maradona or Messi would be great with their left foot. Whatever they could do with their left foot, he could do with both. And he also ends up being that measuring stick in terms of what he was capable of doing on the football pitch. And not only was he able to do it, he was able to do it at such a high level for a consistent amount of years, not playing in Europe, but also playing in one of the best leagues in the world, that was Brazil at that time, and also the Brazilian national team at that time. And it shows you that he was that much better than everyone else he was playing against, even though they were playing in another continent.
Simon, I know very well some football writers, journalists even, who've been around for decades. Not the Johnny-come-latelys, even though not everybody in that group must be disrespected. You know very well Simon Brian Glanville, a man who wrote for, well, he's written for all of the big publications in Britain, and who has seen a lot, who was in the stadium when the magical Magyars destroyed England at Wembley in 1953, it was, before the 54 World Cup. So he would have seen a lot. And a man like him swears blind that Pelé is the finest footballer that ever walked the face of this earth. What would cause a man as educated in the game as him, and he's not just the only one, he's not the only one, there are many who have seen different eras of footballers, have seen football through different periods, who say, there was this Brazilian chap that no individual has eclipsed in terms of singular impact on the game.
He did things that people hadn't seen before. He made moves on the field, turns, moments of trickery, moments of skill, absolute genius that people had never seen the likes of before. He did it also on the biggest stages. There had been great players before Pelé. They didn't have the same kind of debates in the 1950s that we have now, but if they did have, they would have been arguing whether Di Stefano or Puskás from Real Madrid were the two best players in the world. Well, Puskás had a disappointing World Cup, really, in 1954. Di Stefano never played in a World Cup. Pelé arrives as the first superstar that football ever produced. Really the first global sports star, really, of any sport. Because he did it on a bigger stage in an era when people couldn't watch football, couldn't watch the Brazilian Championship, couldn't watch European football from other countries, and so on and so forth. And he just had this ability, the goals he scores, the way he scores them, the way he goes past people and dribbles, the fun he brought to football, the sense of joy that he brought to football was something that really, very, very few players have ever got close to doing. So he took football to a completely different dimension.
Yeah, and Simon, you just referenced the fact that he was a global sports star, not just a football star. And I think that would have been underlined as well when in the twilight of his career and he went to the New York Cosmos for the NASL, his salary was beyond that being earned in the USA by comparative elite athletes from the baseball, NFL, and the NBA. So they're in a continent that glorifies baseball, NFL, and the NBA. And here comes Pelé from Santos in Brazil and in the little regarded sport soccer, and is earning more than the big guns that the Americans idolize, which I think is a huge statement in itself.
It is, and he went around NFL stadiums. Let's remember when the NASL, the North American Soccer League, was created. It was created out of basically amateur and semi-professional football before that in the United States. And suddenly Pelé was able to fill NFL stadiums with 70, 80,000 people for a completely new league. He basically carried that whole league on his back. Of course, there were other great players like Beckenbauer and Cruyff and Quinalha and so on who went and played in that league. But it was all about Pelé. If you ask any American who was around in the 1970s watching soccer or watching any kind of sport, they knew about Pelé. They knew about Pelé. They were watching Pelé. They had memories about Pelé. They'll tell you about the soccer camps that used to take place across the United States where Pelé would coach kids and so on. He absolutely introduced the mainstream American sports public to the game of football.
Yeah, and Juan, some people in trying to lessen the impact of Pelé on Brazilian football and world football at the time Of course, he had won 3 World Cup titles by the time he was 30 years old. They're suggesting that the team was so strong with Jairzinho and Rebellino and Gerson and Tastao and so on that Pelé couldn't help but being a champion because of the players he had around him. Is that fair comment?
No. That year, he was that play. I think he was the first player in a World Cup that actually became the star of the World Cup. If him, and you can even argue that Garrincha 8 years before that ended up maybe also having enough merit to do so. But he, in that World Cup, became the main attraction, the main star, the highest profile player, and also the best performer in that World Cup. And if you even want to look at that Brazil team in 1974, a good part of that nucleus remained intact in 1974, and they were pretty disappointed. They ended up getting kicked out in the group stage. So from that perspective, you end up seeing how important Pelé was, how important and how relevant he was in order to add another dimensionality to that squad that ended up just being one of the greatest squads in history.
Simon, you made a point that I'm going to build a cabin on to talk about Pelé's impact globally, because a lot of these players that we're talking about nowadays are famous because of the internet. Let's be fair. And the fact that you can transmit games, instantly right around the world, everybody can consume if you have an internet connection, if you have a provider. Pelé was world, global famous long before the internet was even an idea in somebody else's mind. There are countries who had programs where children in schools were exposed, well, they weren't taught, but they were exposed to what Pelé is. I can testify to that because in Jamaica, when I was in primary school in the the late 1980s to the very early 1990s, there were books about sporting heroes. So the Jamaican government, Simon, had a book about a non-Jamaican, Sir Gary Sobers, because of his excellence. It had Muhammad Ali because of his excellence. It had Jamaica's very own Don Quarry and his exploits. And it had Pelé. And Pelé was the favorite story that I can picture the cover of the book now. The text was in black and white. The images were in black and white. And it told about how he used to practice by stuffing a sock with other old clothes and making a ball out of it. That was the rags to glory, not even necessarily riches, rags to glory story being told in Jamaica about a man who was several thousand miles away in another continent, in a far removed place on earth. And it's a measure of how impactful he was, that at that time, before the internet, before cable television was the rigor all about, this man was known everywhere.
Absolutely, and his impact on the continent of Africa was huge, at a time when mass communication wasn't widespread in Africa, but you talk to people involved in the game over there, and he was seen as an inspiration in countries where football hadn't been allowed to develop really as it should have been, or hadn't really truly emerged as a national sport in different countries. And there was Pelé, who was showing this remarkable example of what a black man in sport could do. And let's not forget that aspect of it as well, because, maybe the second biggest global sports superstar after Pelé was Muhammad Ali. And I'll leave it to other people to draw sociological conclusions about it. But the impact of having two of the first biggest global sporting superstars, both being black men, I think had an enormous impact on the 20th century.
Absolutely. It was very important for psyche, and I think that was part of the calculated decision of the government in Jamaica at the time to educate youngsters about those heroes, because they looked like us. And it was an invitation to say, well, look at what these people have achieved. You can be anything you want. Gentlemen, stay right there. We have another segment to go. We're taking a quick break and come right back. This is a SportsMax Zone. We're talking about King Pelé. He's off the field at age 82.
There's no one more important.